The first time I saw her, she was a shadow against the neon-lit rain, a ghost moving through the fractured light of Valtis Prime. I didn't know her name, didn't need to. The way she carried herself, the quiet precision, the way the crowd parted around her without ever realizing it, told me everything. She was a killer, and I was her mark. I should have run. Should have lost myself in the back alleys of the lower levels, where no one asked questions and no one lived long enough to regret it. Instead, I stood my ground. Not out of bravery, I'd just been running for too long, and I was tired. She approached without hesitation. I caught the glint of a blade at her hip, the unnatural grace of someone who had long since stopped feeling fear. Silver eyes met mine, cold and unreadable, and I knew she was assessing me the way a predator sizes up a kill. "You're in my way." Her voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of the city. I didn't move. Funny. I was about to say the same to you. A flicker of something crossed her expression. Not anger. Not yet. More like mild curiosity, as if she couldn't quite decide whether I was worth the effort of killing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain kept falling, turning the streets into a mirror of fractured light. Around us, the city moved on, oblivious. Then, without warning, she struck. I barely had time to react. A blur of motion, the flash of a blade. Too fast, too precise. But I'd been in enough fights to know how to move. I twisted just in time, her knife slicing through air where my throat had been a second earlier. She didn't hesitate. Didn't pause to reassess. Another strike, sharper this time. I dodged, again barely. The third would find its mark. I didn't give her the chance. Instinct took over. I caught her wrist, twisted, using her own momentum to throw her off balance. It wasn't enough to overpower her, just enough to make her stumble, just enough to give me a second more of life. Her knee slammed into my ribs. Pain exploded through me, but I held on. Then something changed. She could have killed me then. Should have. I saw the moment her blade hesitated, the way her grip faltered just slightly. A fraction of hesitation, but enough. I met her gaze. "Go." "Ahead," I breathed. "Finish it." Her eyes flickered. The rain streaked down her face, but she wasn't looking at me like a target anymore. Something passed between us in that breath of silence. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. She wrenched free, stepping back. Her blade disappeared beneath her cloak, and in the space of a blink, she was gone. I should have felt relieved, should have counted myself lucky. Instead, I stood there in the rain, my pulse still racing, watching the empty street where she had vanished. And I knew, whatever had just happened between us, it wasn't over. Not yet. The city never slept. But in the darkest hours before dawn, it came close. The neon haze dimmed, the streets grew quieter, and for a little while, the world felt hollow. I leaned against the rusted railing of a forgotten walkway, high, above the lower levels of Valtis Prime, and tried to make sense of what had happened. I should have been dead. Every instinct told me that. I'd seen trained killers before, but none moved like her, effortless, controlled, a blade in the shape of a woman. She could have ended me in seconds. Instead, she'd hesitated, and that hesitation had changed everything. The thought unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. People like her didn't hesitate, which meant, somehow, I had gotten to her. I didn't know if that was a good thing or a death sentence. A faint shift in the air behind me. A sound too quiet for most to hear. I turned, but I already knew. She was there, standing at the edge of the platform, a dark silhouette against the city lights, watching. She hadn't drawn a weapon this time. That should have reassured me. It didn't. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "You're not running." Her voice was calm, but something about it felt different, less certain than before. I exhaled, forcing my pulse to steady. Figured there was no point. A flicker of something in her silver eyes. Maybe amusement. Maybe something else. A gust of wind caught the edge of her cloak, making it billow like smoke. She took a step closer. Not threatening, not yet. Just studying me. Finally, she said, "You don't scare easily." I gave a small shrug. Not much left to be afraid of. She tilted her head slightly like she was reassessing me all over again. That's a dangerous way to live. I almost laughed. Yeah, guess that makes two of us. Something in her expression shifted, but she didn't argue. A silence stretched between us. Not quite comfortable, but no longer hostile. Then, after a moment, she sighed. "I don't fail," she murmured. "It doesn't happen." I leaned back against the railing, watching her carefully. And yet, here we are. She shot me a sharp look, but I could tell it wasn't anger. If anything, it was frustration, though whether at me or herself, I couldn't tell. "I should have killed you," she said flatly. I nodded. "Yeah, I noticed." That earned me a slight narrowing of her eyes. I let the silence settle again before speaking. "So, why didn't you?" Her fingers twitched slightly at her side. A tell, a hesitation. "I don't know." The admission sounded almost reluctant. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. For someone like her, who lived by certainty, the smallest doubt was a crack in an unbreakable wall. And cracks had a way of growing. She shifted her stance, as if uncomfortable with her own thoughts. "This doesn't change anything." I raised an eyebrow. "No?" Her jaw tightened. "You're still a target." I should have felt a surge of fear at that. Instead, I only felt more certain. If that were true, I'd be dead. Her silver eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something behind them. Something tangled and unspoken, something that hadn't been there before. For a moment, just a moment, I thought she might say something real. But then the mask slipped back into place. She turned, stepping back into the shadows, and I knew she was about to disappear again. I don't know why I stopped her. "Wait." She stilled. The air between us felt charged, fragile. I swallowed. "Tell me your name." She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she whispered a name. Not her real one. I knew better than to think that. But it was something, a piece of her. Then, before I could say anything else, she was gone. And I was left alone, staring into the empty night, knowing this wasn't the last time our paths would cross. The city stretched before me, an endless sprawl of neon-lit towers and shadowed alleys. Valtis Prime was a place of ghosts, people who lived in the cracks, who didn't exist on any records, who had no future beyond surviving the next day. I had been one of them for years, moving from one job to the next, staying invisible. But now, I wasn't the only ghost haunting these streets. She was out there, somewhere, watching. I hadn't seen her since that night on the walkway, but I could feel her presence like an unspoken promise. She wasn't done with me. Maybe she hadn't decided what that meant yet, whether I was a mistake to erase or something else entirely. Either way, I knew one thing: she would come back. And when she did, I needed to be ready. The problem was, I didn't know what I was preparing for. The next time I saw her, it wasn't in the shadows. It was in the open. I had taken a job running a shipment out of the lower levels. Nothing special, just enough credits to keep me breathing. The kind of job that shouldn't have gotten me noticed. I was halfway across a crowded market street when I felt it. The shift. A presence at my back, too controlled, too intentional. I didn't turn immediately. Didn't let on that I knew. I kept walking, weaving between vendors and passers-by, pretending I hadn't caught the scent of danger in the air. Only, when I reached an empty side street, did I stop and wait. A few heartbeats later, she stepped into view. She wasn't wearing her cloak this time. Instead, she had dressed like the rest of the crowd, neutral tones, nothing to draw attention. But it didn't matter. Even in disguise, she stood apart. It was the way she moved, the quiet precision of someone who had never needed a second chance to finish a job. I leaned casually against the wall. "You're following me." She didn't deny it. Her silver eyes studied me, unreadable as ever. "You're alive." I raised an eyebrow. That was kind of the goal. A flicker of something in her expression. Something almost like amusement. Almost. "You should have left Valtis," she said. I tilted my head. "Is that advice or a threat?" She took a slow step closer, her gaze sharp. "It's a warning." Something in the way she said it made my pulse quicken. "I don't scare easy." She was close now. Close enough that I could see the faintest scar along her jaw, almost hidden beneath the rain-slicked light. "That," she murmured, "is going to get you killed." The words should have felt like a death sentence. They didn't. Instead, they felt like something else entirely. A test, a challenge, an invitation. I didn't know which one of us moved first. But suddenly the space between us was gone. Her breath was warm against my skin, her presence sharp and electric. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Not about her skills, not about the blade. I knew she could draw in a heartbeat. Uncertain about something deeper, something she had never had to face before. I could have pulled away. I didn't. Neither did she. And in that moment, with the city humming around us, I knew. This wasn't just about survival anymore. I hadn't seen her in days. It shouldn't have bothered me. She was an assassin, a ghost that moved through the underworld unseen. I had no right to expect her presence, no reason to crave the weight of her gaze on me. And yet, I did. Valtis Prime had a way of swallowing people whole. One day, they were there, lingering in the edges of your life, and the next, they were gone, erased, forgotten. I told myself that wasn't what had happened to her. She wasn't the kind of woman who could be erased. She was the storm that wiped others from existence. And yet, something felt off. The market district buzzed with its usual chaos. Vendors shouting, street performers weaving through crowds, the sharp scent of grilled meat and oil hanging thick in the air. I moved through it all without thought, my mind somewhere else. Looking for something. Looking for her. I hated that I had started to recognize the places she liked to lurk. The high balconies, the alley shadows, the rooftops where she could watch unseen. But today, they were empty. She was gone. I didn't realize how deep the unease had settled in my bones until a voice snapped me back to the present. "You look lost." The words weren't hers. I turned sharply. The man standing before me wasn't remarkable. He had the lean build of someone who had survived Valtis too long, his eyes sharp, assessing. He wasn't a threat, not yet. But the way he was watching me told me everything I needed to know. He knew something. "Not lost," I said, keeping my tone even. "Just passing through." A thin smile. "Funny. I heard you were looking for someone." My pulse slowed. Dangerous. I held his gaze. "And who told you that?" His smirk widened. "People talk. Especially when a dead man starts wandering around asking the wrong questions." I force myself to stay relaxed. "Maybe I just like living dangerously." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Or maybe you don't know what you've gotten yourself into." The air between us shifted. The easy amusement in his expression didn't quite reach his eyes. This wasn't just a warning. It was a test. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He shrugged. "A concerned citizen." That was a lie. There were no concerned citizens in Valtis, only people looking for an advantage. "I don't care about whatever game you're playing," I said. "I'm just looking for someone." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "You really don't know, do you?" A chill ran through me. He took a step closer, voice lowering. "She's gone." The words hit harder than I expected. I kept my expression, blank. "Gone where?" Another shrug. "Hard to say. People like her. They don't just disappear unless someone makes them. That wasn't possible. She was too careful, too dangerous. No one could have taken her without a fight. Unless she let them." The thought settled like a stone in my gut. The man watched my reaction carefully, then smirked. "You care, don't you?" I didn't answer, didn't need to. He chuckled, shaking his head. "That's a mistake, friend." He turned to leave. I let him take 2 steps before speaking. "Who took her?" He paused. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking back, he said a name. A name that sent ice through my veins. And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd. I stood there, heartbeat thudding in my ears. She wasn't just gone. She had been taken, and if that was true, I was going to get her back. The rain hammered down in sheets, turning the city's streets into rivers of neon-lit water. Valtis Prime had never felt colder. The moment I heard that name, Tassar, everything in me locked into place. He wasn't just some low-tier criminal. He was the kind of man whose name alone made people disappear. A broker of death, a collector of debts that could never be repaid. If he had her, it wasn't by accident. I moved quickly, shoving through the crowded market district, ignoring the stares. I didn't care if I looked desperate. I was. I should have seen this coming. She had warned me. I hadn't listened. I reached out to the few contacts I had left, people who owed me favors, people who barely tolerated my existence. None of them wanted to talk. They shook their heads, muttered apologies, backed away. Cowards. But not all of them. An old informant named Kess finally cracked. "You don't want to go looking for him," he muttered, keeping his voice low as we stood in the shadow of a half-closed shop. "Tassar doesn't do clean business. If she's in his hands, she's already—" "She's alive," I interrupted, my voice cold. Kess winced. "That hope's gonna get you killed, friend." I stepped closer. "Where is he keeping her?" He hesitated. I didn't. I shoved a handful of credits into his palm, more than he was worth. His eyes flicked between the money and my face. Finally, he sighed. "Old sector. East side, near the shipyards. Warehouse district." I didn't wait to hear more. I was already moving. The industrial district was a graveyard of rusted metal and abandoned tech. Half the buildings were condemned, the other half owned by men like Tassar, men who thrived in the rot of Valtis. I kept to the shadows, scanning the buildings, searching for movement. Then I saw it. A warehouse with 2 guards posted outside, armed but relaxed. That meant confidence. That meant they weren't expecting trouble. That was their mistake. I didn't give them time to react. A quick distraction, a tossed pipe clattering against metal, drew one away. The other turned just in time for my fist to slam into his throat. He crumpled, struggling for breath. The second man barely had time to draw his weapon before I was on him. A sharp twist, a grunt of pain, and he went down hard. I dragged their bodies out of sight, then slipped through the warehouse door. The air inside was stale, reeking of oil and damp metal. Stacks of crates created a maze of shadows, but I kept moving, silent and focused. Then I heard it, a voice, hers. I stopped, every muscle locking into place. She wasn't begging, wasn't crying. She was laughing. Soft, bitter, full of something I couldn't place. I crept forward, inching closer, until I had a clear view. She was seated in a chair, wrists bound, her face shadowed by the dim overhead light. But she wasn't broken. She wasn't afraid. Tassar stood in front of her, arms crossed, a smirk on his scarred face. "You always were a stubborn one," he said. She tilted her head. "And you always talked too much." His smirk twitched. "I could make this easy, you know. You tell me what I want and I let you walk out of here." She chuckled. "We both know that's a lie." I had seen enough. Tassar took a slow step closer to her. That was his mistake. I moved. Fast. By the time he sensed me, it was too late. I crashed into him, sending us both to the ground. He grunted, swinging wildly, but I was already up, already driving my knee into his gut. He wheezed, cursing. His men reacted too slowly. She didn't. Even bound, she kicked out, sending one of them sprawling. I grabbed a fallen weapon and fired. The second man dropped. Tassar struggled beneath me, snarling. "You have no idea what you're doing." I slammed his head against the floor. He stopped talking. Silence fell. I turned to her, breathless. Our eyes met. Something passed between us, something unspoken. Then she smirked. "Took you long enough." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I stepped forward and freed her hands. The moment the bindings fell away, she stood, rubbing her wrists. For the first time, she looked at me like I was something more than just another face in the crowd. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I knew one thing. We weren't done. Not by a long shot. The city burned behind us. Smoke curled into the sky, black against the sickly glow of neon signs. Sirens wailed in the distance, but no one would come. Looking, not for us, not for the bodies we left behind. Valtis Prime didn't care about ghosts, and that's all we were now. She moved beside me, silent as a shadow, her body tense. I had freed her hands, but not her mind. She was still somewhere else, behind those sharp eyes, caught between who. She had been in what came next. I didn't push. Instead, I focused on getting us out. The docks weren't far. I had a way off this planet, a ship that barely flew, running on parts I had patched together from a dozen different wrecks. But it would be enough, as long as she didn't change her mind, as long as she didn't decide I was better off left behind. We reached the shipyard without a word. The streets were quiet, the kind of silence that only came when people knew better than to go looking for trouble. I stopped at the foot of the ramp, turned to her. "You coming?" She hesitated. For the first time since I had met her, she looked unsure, not afraid, just uncertain, like she was standing at the edge of something too vast to comprehend. She had spent her life knowing exactly who she was, an assassin, a weapon, a ghost. Now she had no orders, no master, just a choice. She could walk away, disappear into the night, go back to the life she had known before I ever got in her way, or she could step onto that ship, with me. I saw the moment she made her decision. It was in the set of her jaw, the flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. Then, without a word, she stepped forward, up the ramp, into the unknown. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and followed her inside. The door sealed behind us, shutting. Out Valtis Prime for good. The stars stretched out before us, an endless sea of light and darkness. The hum of the ship was steady beneath my hands, a rhythm I had come to know better than my own heartbeat. She stood near the viewport, staring at the void. I leaned back in the pilot's chair, watching her. "You regret it yet?" I asked. She didn't turn. "Not yet." A pause, then quieter. "Do you?" I shook my head. Not for a second. That earned me a small smirk, the kind that barely curled the corner of her lips. Progress. I didn't know what came next. I didn't. know if she would stay. But I knew one thing. She wasn't supposed to want me, and yet she hadn't left. Maybe that was enough.